This is a segment from The Annex, an academic sociology-themed podcast. For more, visit us on the web at theannexpodcast.com. I really enjoy reading Fabio Rojas's blog posts. You know, he puts himself out there, he gets discussion started, and he has a strong point of view that I don't always agree with, but it's worth engaging. And first of all, by the way, we sat down with Fabio on the Annex this past fall. It's a great episode. Check it out, sociocast.org/annex. But anyhow, Fabio put up a post about Mesearch and how he advises students against it. You know, the basic thrust is that he tells his students, in social science, we try to develop theories of human behavior. We're not here to delve into our own personal experiences. And that whole idea of warning students against Mesearch sparked a little bit of debate. And I wondered, what were your views on that? Like, do you ever talk about Mesearch or the idea of over personalizing your research when you're teaching your students, or is it something that you feel isn't a very forceful criticism? Like Victoria Reyes had a very convincing argument. She says, like, is this a way is this a vehicle for delegitimizing minority scholars who research issues that minority people face? She like points out Max Weber had like a religious mom and a father who worked in the bureaucracy, but nobody says Weber was doing Mesearch. So like, what's your take on Mesearch? Is it something you talk about?
I think for me, I mean, it seemed to me in that exchange and in general, like people do seem to hear Mesearch as something that's used primarily against minoritized scholars of various sorts, right? Queer people doing research on queer things, racial and ethnic minorities doing research on race and ethnicity, and you don't hear it when, like, I was raised by a Marxist. I'm interested in questions of like how do working class people make politics. Nobody is going to accuse me of doing Mesearch because I was raised by a Marxist and I'm interested in the question. Like, all of us are interested in those questions, but right. So I think what Fabio was talking about, or what Kim Whedon on that same post seemed to be interested in, was not people doing research that's motivated by questions from their own experience, because I don't think any of us could be opposed to that. Although when you say you're opposed to Mesearch, it kind of sounds like maybe you are. It seems like what they're worried about is people doing research where they study their own communities and say that only they can study those particular communities, and there's not differences across, and sort of only from the standpoint of membership in those communities can any useful research be done. And if you call that Mesearch, then I think most of us could agree that there's real questions about whether that's the best approach to sociology. But that's not, I think, what many people hear when they say Mesearch, when someone says Mesearch.
Yeah. So on this sort of thing, with I like what you're saying about like this question of like only people with a marked identity are allowed to study that identity, which is kind of the contrary thing. And there was once upon a time an idea that culture clash was an important methodological consideration, and the notion they used to teach this in anthropology that if you're an insider to a culture, you're already so well acclimated to it that you take for granted all the things that go on. And so you gain many of your insights, maybe even most of your insights into how the culture works and what its rules are when you're too clueless to know what they are. And someone has to sit you down and explain them to you. And that's part of the method. And if you're a fully competent member of a culture or subculture, you're not going to get that. And, sociologists generally study people with less social distance from them than, traditional anthropologists who would, go out and study, pre-industrial, very often even pre-literate peoples or pre-state peoples. It's where we almost always study people who, even if they're a different ethnic group from us or something like that, they still, generally speak the same language as our native language. They're, grew up in the same country. So, relatively minor differences by anthro standards. But the funny thing is in anthro, they've been losing that. And anthro has been getting this idea of you can't study someone else and it's somehow imperialist to study someone else. But there's a good argument as like a methodological thing that you'd study someone else to learn more about them, and it doesn't just go one way, right? It's not just like that means that people with an unmarked identity can study people with a marked identity, or people with a socially dominant identity can study people with a socially subordinate identity. The same logic would suggest that people who are marked or subordinate may have special insight into studying the dominant or unmarked group.
Right. I mean, I think I don't hear anybody saying, I guess there are, there's some people who make the case that like no outsiders to any dominated group should ever study that group. But it seems to be the problem most people are identifying is that only outsiders to the dominated groups have studied the dominated groups, or disproportionately, that's who has access to the PhDs, to to the academy, to the research funds, to et cetera, et cetera. The problem isn't the problem that isn't uh, outsiders per se, it's the problem of power overall. And the argument for something that might get called me search is, you know, yeah, if you're too familiar, you might miss stuff, but if you're unfamiliar, you might also miss stuff. And I think that's especially true in sociology, where we're not generally doing what the anthropologists do and living someplace for 2 or 3 years uninterruptedly and really getting a sense for it. If we're doing interview studies, or we're doing something else that's a little bit of a lighter touch than full on anthropological ethnography, then I think it's true that outsiders, probably especially dominant group outsiders, are likely to miss some important stuff.
Well, this is one of those things where the dose makes the poison, and that's true in both directions, right? So, if you only have people from socially dominant groups studying or unmarked groups studying, and by the way, I think we're all using this, but I want to be explicit for the listener. The reason we're saying marked instead of something like people with say a sexuality is because everybody has a sexuality.
Right.
Everybody has a gender. Everybody has a gender identity. Everybody has a race. It's just some of us it's unmarked, whereas others of us it's marked. But if you only have people from the socially dominated or unmarked, or basically outside of the group that's being studied, because kind of the presumption of this would be that um, you have people studying some dominated group, because the fact is sociologists tend to understudy elites, at least using qualitative methodologies. Maybe we overstudy them using other methodologies. I mean, if you think about it, like my stuff on Hollywood is a study of elites,
Right.
but we don't usually think of it as elite sociology.
Hmm.
Um, then that can be overdone, and there could be some insights from having people who approach that subgroup as a native. Um, but the contrary could also be true, that if you only have, if only people go into that and they have a sense of like proprietary ownership over it and see it as somewhat illegitimate for people outside, which does happen. You do hear those critiques. Then that can be bad for it too. And, not just bad in like some kind of moral sense, like it's not fair to people from the socially dominated group that they don't have access to this field site, but also just in the much more important sense, that, which is really the only thing I care about, and that it's bad for the discipline. It you lose insights that way.
Right.
Can I ask? Let me ask about a very so in general. Look, we all come to our research topics with like a background that makes us pretty well versed in certain areas that are required to study, right? Like I went to business school and I studied marketing and finance, so that's what I do here in sociology. But there is one aspect that I can understand, and that's the autoethnography. Can someone like that? To me is me search in a sense,
Yeah.
where you yourself.
It's literally me search.
Right.
Like most of what sociologists call me search is really us search.
Right.
But but autoethnography is literally me search.
Autoethnography. Okay, when I hear this term, it raises alarms, and I am waiting for someone to try to explain this to me in a way where I'm like, oh, that's a convincing mode of science, because it. My suspicion is always like it's pulling the veneer of science over a memoir or a personal opinion piece.
I kind of want to hold a séance with Karl Marx, so that and the whole point of the séance would just be, hey, Karl, you remember that joke you told about how other philosophers had the same relationship to sexual love as masturbation does? Well, you have no idea how bad it would get by the early 21st century.
Well, no, but seriously, like, does anybody is anybody sympathetic to this view? Because here's my thing: like, my understanding of like empiricism is that like the data acts on a check on your subjective presuppositions,
Yeah.
and if you're conducting an interpretive study on yourself, then and you yourself are generating the presuppositions, then how is the act of interpreting your own experience going to present any hazard of disproving your presuppositions. Like it's a loop that I can't get my head around. Does anybody understand this? Can anybody advocate for this to me, or
No, I completely agree with you. I mean, autoethnography is bullshit,
I don't
and it's
understand it?
precisely because you need someone else in. And I remember, like when I was an undergrad, I wanted to do a comparative ethnography of two different field sites, and one of them there was a group there, and then the other, the person who in theory was running it had kind of let it be defunct. He's like, "Why don't you take it over and you run it?" And I'm thinking like, well, that would just be me studying myself. And I'm not interested in how I would do X. I'm interested in how people who actually do X would do X.
Hmm.
And so I'm like, so I cut off that field site. And it didn't even occur to me. It's like, oh, I should do X and then talk about how I would do X.
I mean, I think there's something to be said. I think the term autoethnography makes me itchy in the same way I think it makes you all itchy, right? That if if what we're doing is studying the social world, there should be some social in it, um, and there should be distance between memoir and sociology. Although I think really good memoir or really good sort of analysis of past experiences could be sociological, right? Could be sort of
Totally,
sociologically informed, etc. And I think I've
totally.
seen things. I'm not remembering who the piece was by, but there was a piece that was calling itself autoethnography that was talking about somebody's experiences of racism in a department. That like I kind of wish it hadn't been called autoethnography, but if you're looking back over the data that you've got and you've got emails and you've got notes or you've got whatever, I think you could do something sociological with that. But I'm not sure um, if you get more from calling it autoethnography than you would from saying, here are some experiences I have that
Yes.
illustrate these broader points that I know are true from the literature and so on and so forth. I think
Yeah, that strikes me. I don't know. That still gives me the willies. Because that's basically just like,
At least it's honest. When you are saying ethnography, you are drawing a term that is well established. You
mhm.
know, you're drawing on an imagery of a well established research method, and you're adding a suffix to sort of paint what you're doing as being part of that tradition. But I don't think like I'm no ethnographer. I'll defer to Pat on this one, but like I feel like there's something in the ethnographic tradition that like requires some access to data that exists outside of your head.
I mean, it's one of those things that's always tough, right? And I can't speak on any sort of authority about autoethnography because I haven't read enough of it, and I'm not kind of enmeshed on in the theoretical sort of discussion of the method. But I mean, one of the things about being an ethnographer and being somebody that is kind of heavily or to a degree participating in your field, right? As I did with, stand-up comics, or what someone like Ashley Mears did with her research, where, or even, to a degree, to a lesser extent, like David Grasian playing saxophone in the blues band, right? One of the things is when you're kind of an active participant, I mean, it's you are part of the process. You're part of the social world that you are operating within, and drawing from your own individual experiences as a participant can be very useful because you are experiencing the the social processes and whatnot that other people are undertaking, right? The two issues that always kind of come about though is that as a ethnographer, right, you're not necessarily have, at least with me, you don't know necessarily have as much skin in the game as the people that you're researching, right? The people that I was researching are trying to pursue stand-up comedy as a career. Obviously, I was not trying to, I didn't have aspirations for, being a touring stand-up comic or parlaying that into a writing gig. If I did, I would be highly delusional because I was so bad at it. But one of the things is that, you know, you kind of have to acknowledge the fact of this is your, that's the whole idea of reflexivity. You understand your position within the field. You understand, okay, this is who I am, and what factors of who I am would affect my judgment or affect how people receive me as a fellow participant in the field or a presence within a particular social site. And then on top of that, there is the sort of thing of, as an ethnographer, it's tough to fully understand your presence because it's tough to kind of go outside of yourself, right? You can't like have an out of body experience and understand how people perceive you within the field. I mean, one of the things is that, doing the kind of due diligence of understanding, okay, this is me, this is my social position, this is how people would understand me in this place, and try and get a good sense of it, and kind of creating a, putting your cards on the table and saying, hey, look, this is me, and trying to, in kind of placing yourself, kind of positioning yourself of how would people, my participation compare to other people within the field, or how would me as an individual kind of, how does that kind of gel with how other people within the field would see me. And also, here are some, maybe anecdotes or some occurrences or episodes that really speak to that sort of thing. But I mean, when it comes to autoethnography, I mean, there is this sort of thing where, obviously within ethnography, there is some degree of, soul searching amongst ethnographers to understand who they are and what their presence within the field is. If they're participating, how do I sense this lived experience of being in this particular social space? But, the whole thing with autoethnography specifically of these are my experiences, I don't know too much of, I'm not versed enough in the field to really kind of get a sense of, what the smell test is, or things like that. But I mean, there is, ultimately within the field of ethnography, this kind of thing of your presence in the field, right? It's almost a butterfly effect sort of thing. And that's the whole idea of reflexivity, and getting a sense of, being very self-aware of who you are, and you're experiencing things. If you're a participant, you're experiencing particular things. How is it different? How is it altered? Or how is it not, how is it and how is it not representative of what other people you're studying are feeling, right? So, I mean, if that doesning make sense, I don't.
I mean, it sounds like part of what you're saying is there's always a self in ethnography, and that self always has to be reflected on. I mean, it seems, I mean, again, I don't know too much about the overall uses of the term, but it seems to me sometimes people use it to say, I'm going to talk about an experience that I didn't set out to have be a research experience, but I think is worth talking about as if I might have.
Yeah,
Um, and I, d- I don't know how I feel about that. Like, on the one hand, I think, we are in the social world all the time, and we're observing it, and we're thinking about it. And if we've got, some sort of good means to record that and look back at it, that could be legitimate for helping us understand the social world. But whether that's a like new, but I think there's something to be said for having a research question, or some, going to a site, framing what, thinking about yourself as doing research, and that's research, and then, the rest is just living our lives.
The unanticipated experience is great fodder for a blog post or like a Medium article. I don't know if peer review has to be pulled into that. I don't even know why peer review would be pulled into it. There's only one person, and the world-class expert wrote the piece on the subject.
So there's another aspect to Mesearch that I think we should be talking about. And in a way, I was okay. Let me put this two ways. So one is Pat mentioned Ashley,
yes.
and Ashley Muir's first book was on being a model,
Mm-hmm.
and she had been a model before she went to graduate school, and kind of used that to get back into the site. I'm pretty sure that she had been a model first, and
Correct, she was.
yeah, yeah. So now that's a case where you or I might have a great deal of difficulty, starting out as a sociologist and becoming a fashion model.
Speak for yourself.
Speak for yourself. Yeah, I
Yeah,
got the sweet mustache now that
yeah,
is
yeah.
very attractive.
Yeah. So I mean, that's a case. That's kind of an extreme case where having a certain personal aspect of your biography. Now, in that case, it's not an ascribed trait; it's an achieved trait, right? It was an occupation that she'd pursued at one point, but it gives you access to a field site. And we could see in certain ways that could also apply to ascribed traits as well. That even if, say, a white person can live in a black neighborhood and make black friends and all that sort of thing, they're not necessarily going to have the same experience of that a black person doing those same things would have. So you can see the logic of that, in that and this is why I was saying it's a matter of balance, right? That you don't want uh, people with marked identities all feel they have to study that marked identity, and none of them just want to study network analysis or something like that. And then conversely, people without that marked identity aren't allowed to. You're going to lose out on that. But on the other hand, having a marked identity or having a certain aspect of your biography or having an occupational background can give you access to a field site, either on a binary sense that you're simply not able to do participant observation of fashion models unless you're already a fashion model, but also in like a continuous sense in that it can give you a different degree or kind of access, even if you'll get better access even if you'll lose out on the culture clash. But there's a whole other dimension to Mesearch that we haven't talked about yet, and that Fabio mentioned in his follow-up thing, which is that you know and this I think is actually much less justifiable, is the aspects of personal interest that aren't really an identity and are really only of interest to people like grad students, but you write a dissertation on it. So I'm thinking of like the organic farmers market dissertation.
What do you mean? Oh, because it's like high education. It's like a Bobo type of topic. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah,
It's what?
I'm saying hipster Mesearch is still Mesearch. So talking about the independent record label or the organic vegan food gardening co-op, that's still Mesearch.
Right. It,
Well,
it
I
doesn't.
don't know about that. But go on, Daniel.
I mean, I think those, to just as much as the, studying the disadvantaged group you're from, or the,
Yeah.
queers studying queers, or whatever else
Yeah.
is Mesearch, studying the organic farmers market you like to go to is Mesearch. But I think the issue that a lot of the commenters on that point on that post pointed out is that one kind of research gets critiqued as Mesearch and another kind doesn't,
Mm.
right? Um,
Oh, and they both should.
right.
I mean, we need. I think we definitely need studies of sexuality and race and gender, and I'm interested in sexuality. I'm probably going to work some of it into my book. And I think we could probably get by as a discipline if we didn't have any studies at all of farmers markets. So
Well, come on. All right, anyhow.
no, I'm not saying that we can't have any, but I'm just saying like if we had zero sociology of sexuality or zero sociology of race and ethnicity, you'd be like, what the fuck are you guys doing? That you're missing this huge aspect of human life and existence. Whereas if we had, never had an article in ASR ever on farmers markets, you wouldn't even notice.
Well, can I say, as a Canadian who studies social policy, because I'm sure that we're a dime a dozen, and it's sort of the same
Yeah.
thing. I think like the problem doesn't come from when you draw on your unique perspective to pick a topic, but rather you engage in a study wanting a particular result, and you're engaged in a form of advocacy for a particular outcome or for a particular worldview. And
Yeah.
I speak about, I think that's what Fabio's getting at. And I do the same thing with our students. But the way I put it is, try to pick a thesis or dissertation topic where you don't care what the result is. Like, you're setting up the test and you're letting the chips fall where they will. And do it just because it's easier. It's because you don't have to contort data to meet your preordained conclusion, but you could just set up a good test where you win no matter where the chips fall.
And I would say, in addition to that, one of the problems with what people tend to characterize as Mesearch, and I would include this not just of your own stigmatized identity, but also of the farmers market where you shopped even before you decide to turn into a dissertation. Is so many of these Mesearch things are about subjectivity, and honestly, that's not that interesting. Like, I don't really give a shit about, like, I mean, I care and I'm interested the first time I read it, but by the dozenth time I've read it, I'm not interested in the subjective experience of stigma. Like, we need studies of that, but we don't need dozens and dozens and dozens of them. And I'm interested maybe the first time I read it, but the dozenth time I read it, I don't care about how people at the independent record label construct authenticity. I just don't care. I get tired of it. And it's like, and so I think that's the other problem with the Mesearch. It's just the same fucking research question over and over again. And it's not an interesting research question. It's not about structures of causation and, how this gets reproduced. It's just about how people feel. That's not research.
I mean, I think there's something to be said for, I mean, you said this, for research on how people feel, but I think and I would disagree a little bit with the pick something you don't care about, but I think the thing that I think really people are concerned about, who are critiquing Mesearch or who are critiquing scholar activism, who are critiquing all these things, is they're worried that people will do a study where if they don't get the answer they expect, they're not going to publish it, or they're going to fake it, right? And that's the sort of
Or even
fundamental.
worse, yeah, I would say fake it is actually the best, although not necessarily in a conscious sense. I think sometimes when people are too deeply committed to a question, they can't even perceive, when reality contradicts them.
Right. But I think that, I mean, I think I think a lot of people who think of themselves as scholar activists and who think of themselves as objective social scientists would say, would agree that what you have to do a study where you could get the answer you don't expect. And if you do that, you have to be willing to like grapple with that answer and make
Mhm.
sense of it. And that's where the sort of, is it research or is it not, comes in, right? If you want to advocate for a position and you already know what that position is and you already know what the world should do about it, then you don't need to be a sociologist, you should go be an activist.
Yeah.
But if you want to advocate for a position and you're pretty sure that X is a problem, but you want to actually find out, is X a problem and what things work to solve it, then you need research. And
Mhm.
that's what research can be good for. So I would never tell my students, pick something you don't care about, but I would tell them, make sure you're asking a question that you could find out your belief is wrong.
But there's
Yeah.
also people have to separate the values, or sort of like what they want, and their study. Like, I might want poor people to do better, and I might think that minimum raising the minimum wage would help pull poor people out of poverty. But like if it doesn't, then it's not going to work. It's not going to achieve that end goal. But maybe a lot of people approach the topic thinking, we need to get this win on minimum wage because it's going to do it, and not really, not thinking about the means, or
Right.
getting too fixated on a means.
Minimum wage is actually a really good example, because when Seattle raised the minimum wage, they hired a team to do an evaluation of it, and then they didn't like the results they got, and so they went and hired another team.
It's a schlep. You have to remake yourself. Like, that happened to me.
Mhm.
I believed that consumerism was a problem, and then there came a point when it's just I couldn't deny it, and I think I became a
You went to Walmart and you're like, "There's some great stuff and it's cheap."
well, no, there's just a lot of evidence that I don't think
Yeah.
consumerism is not what's going on. And when I finally confronted what I observed and changed my belief system, I was able to develop something more interesting. I think I'm better off for it. For more, visit us on the web, theannexpodcast.com.